Okay. Yes. Hello, everyone. And yes, I'm aware that people will watch this now on YouTube, but I wasn't aware of that last time, and it's had 97 views, which makes it so I need to bear in mind that as well, that people also people may have seen my last talk on this topic of climate psychology, but some of you haven't. Now, so yeah, I'll just introduce myself. I'm Emmie Williamson. I'm a recently retired clinical psychologist. I used to work in mental health services in Northamptonshire. So I'm going to just share my screen. I'll just do this for a minute. Okay. And then so, yes, my last talk, if any of you've seen it, was a great whistle-stop tour of climate psychology, very much my own putting together of various aspects of climate psychology, because it's really quite multidisciplinary. I think a lot of it is maybe overlaps with, for instance, culture studies and political science and so forth and so on. But climate psychology is, if you like, pulling things together um, and adding in layers of psychology in there. But we're being very clear that this psychosocial approach of psychological theory that encompasses sociocultural aspects rather than being about the individual is what climate psychology does. So if you saw the last talk, you'll know that there was a massive amount of content in there, and that's partly why I've come back to some of it is revisiting some of that content. So bear with if it's a bit annoying to see it all again. But as it went so fast last time and there was so much, I think revisiting some of it is important. And also, this focus, particularly today, is on the psychological roots of the climate crisis and meta crisis. Last time, the talk had psychological roots, it had psychological responses, and it had psychological approaches. That's why there was so much. So I'm doing, if you like, two more talks, this one on psychological roots, and then the psychological responses, psychological impact, and approaches will be next time. So I have got new material today, and when I put it all together with what I wanted to revisit, it was a massive amount. And it's quite hard to know where to start. There's a lot being written about aspects very relevant to this. So really what we're talking about is why on earth has this happened, that we're in such a crisis? I thought, how do I start? And I thought, well, I'm a clinical psychologist. And as a clinical psychologist, which is different maybe from other psychologists, we do what we call clinical formulation. I thought, why don't I bring that approach to this talk? Clinical formulation is making sense of very complex mental health crises. So we need to make sense of such complexity when there are many factors and they're interacting. We need to understand what's happened to the person, and what that clarity then leads us into, if you like, a story and a narrative that then helps us decide what needs to happen next. That might be interventions, it might be trying to increase something in the person's life. So I'm bringing that to this talk because a mental health crisis has overlaps, if you like. We could see parallels with the planetary crisis, the meta crisis. So a formulation, let me explain a bit more. This, if you like, is how we make sense of something really complex. And basically, psychological formulation involves, it's certainly in my field, it was biopsychosocial. So we include the biological, the psychological, and the sociocultural, and how they all interact. In the psychological, in the mental health services, we were a little bit reluctant to include too much biology because that tended to be overemphasized in mental health crises, and that would then sideline context and complexity that was really important. But actually, if you give a balance to all of these, that then gives a very full explanation. So what I'm saying is, we don't want to go too individual about individual people, what they do, but we don't want to ignore that either. And we don't want to overemphasize culture and politics, but we want all of it and the psychological in between. So in other literature, I found this idea of nature culture continuum, which is what we're talking about here. And the model that we often use in clinical psychology is called the 5 Ps. And this gives a nice structure that I'm going to use today. Some of the slides are a little bit of a list of factors, but I'm hoping that the structure gives us a real clarity. I'm also wanting to say that this is me putting this together. Particularly aware that this is going out in YouTube and that psychologists might watch it, or other academics and scholars. I'm wanting to say that, this is me putting something together. It's not a comprehensive coverage. Other people either hear or watching it or think, well, she hasn't mentioned this or that, or I would emphasize that. Yeah, this is me putting something together, and actually I might actually regret sort of not adding certain things. I've got a certain aspect that I want to emphasize, but there's so much. But it leads to some clarity about different interventions. So this is the 5 Ps. We outline the problem. That is not as straightforward as you'd think. So for instance, in mental health crises, some people might think something is a problem, and other people or the person themselves might think it's not a problem. An example being the role of substance use. Sometimes a person feels that's not the problem, that's actually helping them cope, whereas a family member might think that that's the main problem. So outlining what the problem is, and obviously in this case, we've got a whole load of the world's population in denial and wouldn't say what we're saying is a problem. So anyway, that is an important thing. How is the problem being constructed? But I won't spend too long on that today, because you're all here probably because you do all agree what the problem is. So then predisposing factors, well, I'll explain that as we go through. Precipitating factors, where the crisis really kicks in. Perpetuating factors, that's, keeping it going, vicious circles. And protective factors, which are vital in the stage of thinking how we're going to get out of the crisis, what needs to happen. So as last time, I'm showing this diagram of 30 years of warnings. So this is a key thing, is that we have known for so long, and yet we've got this massively increasing emissions and temperature, and we are now not at 1.1 as it says here. We're at 1.5. We're pretty sure. I think technically they're saying 1.3, but I mean it is a dire situation. Industrial revolution is in there, but if we had a closer look at that, it starts the uptick, but the rapid exponential increase or the vertical direction is really what I would call, and I think others have called it, the great escalation, which is really since the 80s. So we're going to talk a bit about this. And agriculture gets underway. As you can see, earlier on, and that's important in my formulation as well. This is another part of the problem that I wanted to raise that I didn't in the last talk, and is now being written about much more in climate psychology. It's climate silence. So, you know, it's what I think everybody will have encountered, you know, at certain times with certain people where you want to, or you mention the climate crisis, and it just sort of falls extremely flat. Someone might nod or look concerned, but there is no continuing of the, in fact, it's often very awkward because people just don't want to talk about it. And that's also the case in the media and so forth when there are catastrophes happening all over the globe. And yet, you know, I noticed on the BBC News, for example, there was just obviously there's some really important things going on as well, but there was plenty of other quite trivial things being reported and nothing about the catastrophes and nothing about COP29 really. I mean, I'm not surprised because I think people have lost hope with that. But anyway, it's a definite thing and part of the problem. So we're going to think about predisposing factors and the book. So I'm not putting, this isn't an academic presentation. I'm not going to be putting references and so forth, but I am putting pictures of a few books that makes it, if you like, a bit sort of more real how people have written about it. But this one about don't even think about it, why our brains are wired to ignore climate change. It's what it says on the tin. This is a great book, very, very accessible. And but there's quite a lot written as well about evolution, and this book does a bit about that too. So we're going back in time. And I think this is, if you like, narrative and story. We often, with a formulation, talk about doing a timeline. And in some ways, what I'm talking about today is a timeline. So going right back in human evolution, were we possibly destined to explore, exploit, and overshoot? It does seem, you know, with evolution, there are, it selects for things that will favor the expansion of a species. And obviously we expanded in these kinds of ways and seem to be natural explorers. And exploitation is really what any species does when there's a lot of resources there, and overshoot, ecological overshoot. So we are overshooting by far. There's something written about the hope principle that I came across, which I rather thought was important, about this continual desire for humans for a better life, that's really always kind of been there, that sort of is a drive. Then there's the aspect of risk perception that are, if you like, we can think of it as being our wiring, that there's a faulty alarm that doesn't really detect complex, slow-moving or distant threats. We're much more about what's in front of us. Certainly we are now, and that's something I'll come to in a minute. We have another, if you like, concept that's been written about is that what we're talking about with the climate crisis is that it's a hyper object. It's really too big. It's the slowness again. It's happening in slow time, and it's often far away. Very hard for our heads to get around it really, and people, you know, it is difficult to really take on mentally. Then there's the cognitive biases, things like conformity, that we conform with others, things like bystander effect, where we think someone else will deal with it, you know. There's also things like confirmatory bias, where we confirm what we'd like to believe really by selecting what we see and what we, you know, what evidence we substantiate our beliefs with, that kind of thing. Attention, selective attention. So predisposing factors, why is there a God there? I've had fun with just putting some pictures in this. So predisposing factors, we're still on the predisposing factors. This is what are the things that have maybe led us to the crisis, the sort of background factors. So disconnection from nature, I mentioned about eco-psychology last time. This is absolutely key. You know, it probably around the agricultural revolution time when we separated from our lives separated from nature, or we saw nature as something to be used, really. And that sort of also somewhat coincides or is bolstered by the beliefs of humans having dominion, and certain religions sort of particularly emphasizing this. And it's still very much, you know, in our belief system, rather than, if you like, having sacredness within every being, and that we are just part of the ecosystems. We are now quite see ourselves as superior and separate from nature. Again, part of this is having external gods. This goes right back Greek times, wherever we want to start that. But as I said, maybe more Eastern cultures do still have more beliefs in the sort of interbeing, the internal divine, if you like, and that we are all part of a divine rather than there being an external God. So having external gods then puts it that you're not worshipping the very nature that we are part of. You're worshipping something outside. So the sacred of nature, the sacredness went out of nature in the Western world. And then, of course, the Enlightenment, when a sort of rationalism and empirical science sort of, the idea that we will, I mean, there's a lot of very good stuff. It's great in many ways in terms of the advancement of humans and society and civilization, but it very much favored being rational, empirical, so measuring and observing, and we begin to lose the more, if you like, expansive aspect of our psyche, as we go more narrow in our focus. And then we come to the divided brain, and a brilliant book, which it's a big, thick book, so I'm still plowing through it. The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain and the Making of the Western World. So here we have a picture of the brain with the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And there's been a lot of popular stuff written about them. But this book talks about the very nuanced relationship between the two hemispheres. Basically, we would say that the right hemisphere is very much about open attention. It's very much about whole picture thinking. It's actually very good at threat detection. It's very much for that sort of vigilance. And it's got, if you like, we tend to think of it as the more emotional, spiritual area, the area of mystery and art, creativity, and instinct. And that is really, that used to be, if you like, the master. And the emissary was the part that would then execute what was needed to be done, and do things. And as humans evolved, it was around categorization and words, language, and, you know, very sort of concrete thinking, very focused attention compared to that very open attention of the right. So really what the book is saying is that there's it's not that the brain starts this, there's a complete reciprocal interaction between the the brain and the culture. Our brain is very plastic, and epigenetics is something that means that we can have evolution quite quickly in terms of change of the brain. And culture, you cannot separate them. You can't say which comes first. But the culture of rationalism, of narrow focus, basically what it's saying is that the left brain has now become dominant. It has turned on its master, if you like, because it literally can suppress the right brain. When the left brain is working, it inhibits the right brain. They can inhibit each other, actually. So this is absolutely vital in many, many ways in thinking what's going on, and why things, if you like, are getting worse, because we've lost something, we're losing something very vital, and with it comes, as you'll see in my lists to come, what we're losing. I can refer back to this. So obvious precipitating factors. So when in mental health, in complex cases, we think about very obvious things can happen, like a sudden trauma or something like that. And this is what we had, of course, discovery of fossil fuel energy. We've already got those predisposing factors building up, if you like. And then, boom, we have this incredible amount of energy. I mean, I've put a bit of a negative take on there. Clearly, there's been amazing advances, and I must say that this narrative I'm giving is a bit on the negative side. I think it's because we're all feeling a bit negative at the moment. So it is a bit of a negative narrative. But there's loads of good stuff that came out of the massive sort of expansion of technology that's been made possible by fossil fuels in many ways. But greed and power seeking is part of the escalation, perhaps. Advertising. So I'm just going to start listing things, which gets a little bit dull, but it's the only way I can really get everything down. Digital media. These kinds of things have really sort of speeded up the whole of the great escalation. And then, of course, this idea of neoliberal culture, which is sort of linked with free market capitalism. Again, a key book, Sally Weintraub, writing about neoliberal exceptionalism and the culture of uncare. So neoliberalism is really a phrase often used rather critically, really, about this time really since the 80s, Thatcherism, Reaganism, when really radical privatization happened and the shrinking of the state. And within that, obviously, the private sector needing profits, needing advertising, needing consumers, they need to create us to be consumers, and they need to create feelings in us that make us want to consume or need to consume. And then that also causes us to become like that we feel we're quite exceptional, because we need to see ourselves very individually. Exceptionalism is a key thing. We've all got this in us. You can start noticing it. I can notice it. Oh, well, that does, I'm an exception in some way, or this is an exception. And we let ourselves off many hooks. But there is, I think, with the picture I'm going to paint, that this is particularly prevalent in large sections of society that are really, really not reflective at all about how they're behaving. So I think even though we've all got little bits of these traits, I'm going to really focus in on this particular kind of cultural phenomenon of entitlement, narcissism, individualism. And obviously now we've had the election of a narcissist into the US presidency. I think really it's been proven that this has become absolutely mainstream. So there is this compulsive consumption, all this social comparison going on. So making people want to consume, and they want things, and everything now is being designed to be addictive, whether it's digital, whether it's food. And, you know, we know in so many sort of scandals and problems like the big tobacco, and all sorts of things that are, and sugar, ultra processed food. There's all this sort of addictive nature to things, and also conspicuous consumption. So really showing things off online and so forth, creating, making people feel ashamed if they're not doing what the norm is, and creating envy. So these are the drives of today. Also, there's this very much competition orientation, the masculinization. When I say that, I'm not talking about men, I'm talking about masculinization. So masculine, feminine, you know, we can have masculine women and feminine men, but as traits, our culture is getting full of masculine traits. There's a lot more aggression, competition, domination, and you know, some of that is, I'm not judging it, I'm just saying that's there. But part of it that I think we can say is really unwelcome is this culture of uncare that has been growing. Uncare being this great sort of concept. I'm not sure if it was there before Sally Weintraub, but this is a key concept. I mean, if we think of value systems, how low paid, these are the more obvious aspects, low paid care work, for example, women's work or domestic work being seen as virtually valueless, whereas financial services, digital services, engineering, you know, all very highly paid. And, you know, I think some of the gender pay gap is important in looking at that difference. But it's much bigger than that, isn't it? It's about the fact that people are so individually focused, they are so disconnecting from others and from nature, that they're not caring about nature or others so much as getting what they need. And that I came across, it was actually on a podcast, a speaker talking about domination orientated culture compared with partnership orientated culture, which I get to at the end. But domination orientated culture, obviously, we are looking at increasing autocracy going on. Again, it goes a bit with that sort of masculinization and so forth, and it's a very worrying trend. All of this is kind of relevant to the whole aspect of the direction that it's going, in terms of not caring about the softer aspects of life. And in that, we know that then is very determined just to destroy and extract, really. So then we come to well, not necessarily vicious circles, but there will be within there perpetuating factors. So we've precipitated this crisis, and now it's got well, actually, there's the podcast that I like, The Great Simplification, talks about the superorganism. It's become a massive thing in itself, unstoppable, really, in many ways. But I know this talk it goes a bit depressing, but it is a depressing situation, and we do go into the positive at the end. Conscious and unconscious psychological defenses are a big part of it, and they're at a cultural level as well. So these keep us all from you know, there's absolute denial out there, and we know that in the States 50% of people pretty much deny that the climate crisis is happening, or that it is a crisis, or that it's human made. It's the denial of the science, and individuals as well can do that. And then there's soft denial, and I'll go into these more in the next one. I did in the first talk, and I will in the next one. but it is part of the perpetuating factors. Another important one that we've noticed, if you like, particularly around the universities and so forth, is the devaluing of the humanities, philosophy, critical thinking, art of a certain type. There's art that's very left brain is taking over, but if you like, that more sort of ethereal art, but spirituality and the sacred. So I'm talking here much more right brain stuff. And because these things don't lend themselves to profit, and universities having now to make business cases and so forth, and getting more and more focused on what will lead to a job, what will lead to profit, what will bring us money, this is devaluing and we need the humanities to be critical of, and to really, for everybody in society to be able to have critical thinking, and to regain spirituality and the sacred. I think these are going to be vital things to regain. I could do a whole podcast about this is not a podcast, a whole talk about algorithms and AI. I'm not an expert, but I think anyone who is worried about the way the world is going will know that these things are rapidly speeding everything up. And AI is very worrying, including, for instance, the Spanish floods recently, the Valencia, the awful images of the cars stacked up. If there was conspiracy theory going around that this was AI generated imagery. I mean, where are we going to be if people don't actually believe what's on their screens about the catastrophes that are happening elsewhere? So the combination of conspiracy theories and this certainty is very left brain as well, left hemisphere. Is someone needs to mute? No, okay.
Is that me? Sorry.
No worries. Yes, so we know that all of this is perpetuating and it escalating. The polarization and the duality of thought, the black and the white, again, that's very left hemisphere. It's also out there in the media, the culture, and the polarization is very worrying. And it's interesting to see what's happening with X or Twitter, how everyone's going to blue sky. And it's going to be basically a Twitter for lefties and a Twitter for right wingers. And, we're getting more and more split and unable to be in the unambiguous grey areas in our thinking. Part of that is about hyperarousal. So something in clinical psychology we talk about a lot is this hyperarousal that often happens with trauma. And we are having in the global society increasing levels of trauma. We're also getting traumatized by things in the media and so forth. There's, if you like, more subtle forms of trauma and also ways that the media is evoking our adrenaline and hyperarousal systems, our sympathetic nervous systems, our fight and flight system. There's also emotional neglect at some level happening because of disconnection and dissociation from emotion. Again, we're getting thoughts and feelings getting more and more separated. The left brain or rational brain and the emotional brain getting a mind getting further apart. It's getting harder, if you like. We're getting dominated by thinking words and shouty stuff, and this is not good when we're losing the way to know and be in touch with our feelings and others' feelings, and conflict is increasing. This is why I've got the red vicious circles, because you can see how it's all feeding itself. So increasing levels of emotional dysregulation, a big phrase for us in clinical psychology, because it tends to underpin every crisis. However it's caused, you go into dysregulation. So regulation is being calm, and dysregulation is losing that calm and getting if you like, into fluctuations, sometimes between dissociation and over-arousal. Mentalizing, in case any psychologists watch this, mentalizing is another aspect of clinical psychology and psychology generally. It's vital. It's a kind of subliminal understanding of how other people's minds work or are working. When you're with people, you are picking up how they are working. Even if you're driving a car, you're kind of anticipating how a driver might drive. This kind of theory of mind, or being able to think about minds, is something that needs a calm head. Otherwise, you start to interpret things incorrectly. And so it increases levels of paranoia, for example, and conspiracy. And reflective capacity and empathy are reduced as well. This is a bit of a blurry graphic, but a very key graphic in terms of what I've been talking about. This squeezed, the window of tolerance is getting squeezed. It says comfort zone here, but I'd say the zone of being able to think wisely and reflect is getting squeezed. We're either, if you're hyper-aroused, you're overactive, distressed, obsessive. If you're hypo-aroused, you're dissociated, disconnected from feelings, numb. And all of this is happening. And as we get, if we remember, for example, Trump sort of increasing the adrenaline in all of us just by watching him on the news, or let alone following the media, this again leads us more into these hyper-aroused states. This is going slightly off, but another phenomenon that I've reflected on, this sadness of this tree, you know, the Sycamore Gap tree, the beautiful tree that was cut down. And then these are severed EV chargers, so the cables have been cut. Why I've brought this in is that I was literally searching on ZapMap for EV chargers in the north of England, somewhere in a certain area. And many of the reports, because they were live reports, said that the cables had been cut. Obviously, we've always had vandalism. This is something that is increasing. And I'm not an expert on Freudian defense mechanisms, but I know that reaction formation is one of them, where you go to the opposite extreme. And it feels a bit like that, where care and love and good things are not just inviting cynicism, they're actually eliciting violence and vandalism. There's this angriness about the woke and the kind and the nice and wanting to care and distribute and so forth. There's such anger. So, we really are in trouble, I think. And I brought this up last time, and because discourses, the narratives out there, the stories that are out there in the media that are being mainly, encouraged by the self-interested sort of wealthy elites and fossil fuel interests. I wanted to come back to it just because we couldn't spend long on it last time, and we can't again now, I'm afraid. But I couldn't do this talk without mentioning discourses in the media and so forth. This is how language is used. Discourses used for power, for reasons of power, in the service of power. So you can see, I'll just take a sip and you can have a look. Let's have a look at redirecting responsibility. So what aboutism? What about China? Why do we have to do something when China's doing all that? Individualism, which is sort of, it's all about me. I won't go into every one of them, but then there's the pushing non-transformative solutions. So techno-optimism, technology will fix it. Maybe this is happening a lot of greenwashing, talking about doing action and there is actually little done. And of course, the fossil fuel companies and so forth are saying that they will solve it, and hence they're kind of running the last 3 COPs, which is just ridiculous. But carrots without sticks, so we can do it in a nice way, can't we, without losing anything or particularly changing anything. Let's not go too fast either. And then there's emphasizing the downsides, you know, this the Stone Age man, this idea that we're returning to the Stone Age if we, you know, that solutions are returning us to the Stone Age. But and then there's surrender, of course, that change is actually impossible. And there might be a nod towards like, let's focus on adaptation. And yes, we need to, but it's really beginning to be an area that suits those interests as well, to not to downplay the decarbonisation aspect. There are many others. And of course, last time, many of us felt for this poor little koala bear who's being accused of having a mental health problem because it's distressed by all the trees being cut down. So diagnosing, individualizing, or calling someone an alarmist, or you know, being alarmist. These are discourses that make us feel ashamed of getting emotional, getting distressed, crying. You know, people think you're mad or oversensitive or something, and that again suits the bigger system. So we have to join up to validate each other, and that feels good when we do. So very quickly, I realize I'm running out of time. The other thing the brain or the person, the human, struggles with is certain short-term loss to mitigate for uncertain long-term loss does not compute. So people really don't want to lose their way of life and their status. They don't want to feel bad about what they're doing. This is all very obvious, but we have to put this down. Cognitive dissonance is very uncomfortable, so it would be better really to just go fully into denial or even attacking the people trying to raise the alarm. Diversion by powerful elites to scapegoat elsewhere, that's readily accepted. And if you think about it, there is a real lack of, you know, it's all too readily accepted. And the other diversion is, of course, entertainment. And that, I think, is really, in the Don't Look Up film, what they do very well, how we just want to be entertained. We just want to be happy. We're entitled to be happy and entertained, and as good consumers. And then, of course, the rise of the strong man in geopolitics, exploiting all of the above. So basically, this is where we're at. And this is another fantastic film. And his face says it all, really, as it does on the film, The Age of Stupid. Sounds harsh, but it really feels that way. So let's get on to the protective factors. What we want more of. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to zoom through these because of timings. But I want some time for people's questions, but I'm sorry if there isn't that much time left. So in formulation, we always talk about the protective factors. This is vital in leading us into thinking about what needs to happen. Now, one of the things I've noticed a lot of is that if people start talking about what needs to happen or visions of how it could be in the future, they can often start to encounter cynicism or doomism that isn't so helpful. We have to keep focused on some sort of optimism or deep radical hope. It's not hope that everything will be all right. We're not going to have that kind of hope. That is naive, but it is about finding hope. And these areas are areas of hope. So something that George Marshall in Don't Even Think About It book research, he talks quite a lot about the different research, and this has been shown to be the case that even in the most individualized, selfish people, cultures, that they still pull together when there are catastrophes. And community, in the interviews afterwards, they all say they're so proud of their community. They kind of feel their community is particularly strong and they're really proud of it. But it does have that effect. They might even deny it's climate change. This is something he talks about, where, you know, these catastrophes are getting, especially with the evangelical Christianity or other approaches that say, well, actually, it's sort of God that's deciding. It's not us, you know. So the other positive, I think we might not have thought so once, but deglobalizing is happening naturally because supply chains are beginning to falter. And we're beginning to realize it used to be seen as protectionist and negative for countries to want to, you know, just do their bit within their nation. But I think that's the way we're going to need to go. And certainly Trump is going to take the US that way. Localism, so getting more and more local with networks and councils. Hopefully, this government does devolve more powers to local communities and councils, because this is the way to go. We're not going to get the change that we need from top down. Obviously, that will happen gradually, and there are some good things happening, but it's way too slow, and is what we can do at a local level that's going to count. So there are these aspects of deep adaptation, strategic adaptation. These are writers that have written about these kind of aspects of adaptation, where it's a lot of it's psychological, the deep adaptation, about deep acceptance, but also really, really connecting with others. So we all know that at a certain point, there's a social tipping point, you know, where enough people are behaving or communicating in a certain way, and that it takes off and it can go in a positive way. Sally Weintraub in her book talks about lively entitlement, being entitled to, you know, a compassionate government, being entitled to, you know, to life, to nature. And this is, if you like, fueling protest movements, which are a good thing, and we've got to have them protected. But of course, we know they're under threat. But there's a lot of bravery out there, and I know there's people on this call who are protesters themselves, and well done you. I think there's a huge amount of courage, massive amount of courage involved, and I'm really hoping that the trend of the law goes the other way than it's been going. And we've got a mushrooming of the climate action groups, of course, and including Climate Action West Northants, yay! And community engagement is increasing around this, and networks, then we validate each other. And climate cafes help us go right brain and really sort of whole picture, emotional. You know, what I love about Corn is that, you know, there's the meetings like this that are left brain, you know, let's get the knowledge, let's get the concepts. And then we do right brain in the climate cafes, where we just go flowing and, you know, into emotion and, you know, just wherever it goes. So good for Corn. That's what we need. Continuing. So scholarly analysis, and a nod to David Ragg, who has written to me since my last talk, and written this excellent book, of which I've read the introduction, David, if you're watching. But and obviously very relevant. But one of the things as well that is clear from many of the things I've read and listened to is there's a lot of scholarly analysis, multidisciplinary or transdisciplinary, all sorts of people. Polymaths are on the rise that, you know, are getting really good at everything from psychology to ecology to political science, and they're merging it all to this amazing, complex, critical and systems thinking. So I really see that on the rise. They are worried about being shut down, though, which is interesting if we think left, right brain. anyway, we have got climate science. So far, I think people are now having to believe the climate science and climate psychology. People like myself trying to talk about, if you like, the more reflective capacity that we need, that everyone needs. Education. It would be great if we can actually start really changing children's education, but for now, there's some great carbon literacy training just rolling out everywhere. And we've got 2 in this county. We've got Claire, and we've also got Emily in the north offering climate literature. There's probably more as well. Methods of communication are being really understood now, such as needing a positive change narrative. Again, the George Marshall book has quite a lot on this, and we're beginning to know how we need to communicate and how we might have been getting that wrong, because basically facts are not going to do it. Telling people we're doomed is not going to do it. We need to engage the emotions and positiveness, as well as the message about how serious it is and how close and how it's here now. Partnership oriented cultures. So the Nordic countries, we've got this happening now compared to, so when we talk about Western culture, actually the Nordic culture is now really splitting away in terms of so they are very, if you like, they're exemplifying a framework of care. Basic values around well-being rather than GDP. We need well-being to be what we measure most, and drop the whole GDP thing. And growth, economic growth at all costs, is really damaging. So partnership oriented being about collaboration. So they have political parties that actually collaborate properly, that properly communicate with each other. And they all tend to they value care and care work, childcare, that kind of thing, very highly valued. High tech, they're all pro high taxes for distribution of wealth and that kind of thing. And they are the happiest cultures as well. So then we've got the arts. Avatar created a huge movement, really, of wanting to protect nature and so forth. Don't Look Up is another film, The Age of Stupid, upcoming film 2073 to look out for. There's eco-fiction, eco-poetry, cli-fi. All of these engage much more the right brain, the emotions, the bigger, the sort of more ambiguous, sort of exploratory aspect of us. Then another wonderful framework that helps, and actually we need to change to, is more like a Buddhist philosophy, as ancient wisdom, that it's about interbeing, that we are part of one big divine, if you like, that we are all Buddha, that that there is a much more expanded sense of self. And of course, we're learning mindfulness, many of us, and meditation, and that again helps the right brain to, and the instinctiveness and the sort of that's what we need much more, the empathy and the feeling of connection. Again, we've got Gaia theory being promoted again. Some of these things really sort of coming right back, and eco-psychology showing us ways to reconnect with nature properly, and to think of ourselves as just a part of an ecosystem rather than something superior or outside of nature. And that, I think, is huge. And Rupert Reed is talking about building inner resilience, which is about what we've already got as humans. We process things, we love, we can trust. And then outer resilience is coming together, and he talks about the great coming together. And I really love that. So on that note, I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really, really good. So many things to sort of reflect